Hi everyone, I'm coming to you today from a voiceover because I don't have time to film my face. So I'm actually going to voice over this whole video, talk about Elia, where she came from, all that, just very briefly, and then we're going to talk about her tail, and then after that I'm going to go ahead and answer frequently asked questions about drop tails and give you a couple tips about how to treat your gecko if it has a dropped tail. So if you want to know more about Elia, I'll include a link right up here at the top of the screen because she doesn't look like a normal leopard gecko because she has metabolic bone disease and was a rescue. Again, watch her whole story if you're curious because I'm not going to go into the whole thing here. So Elia first dropped her tail on June 19th, and she dropped it during shipping. So I think what happened is she just had a really horrible time with shipping, but all the other geckos I've ever had shipped to me, all the other animals in fact, have never had any dropped tails, any injuries, anything like that. So I'm wondering if she just had a really rough time, or if she just took it really hard and was really stressed about it. I don't know. But all I know is when she arrived, her tail was separate from her body. There was blood on the paper towel. It was horrible. It made me very sad. And in fact, if you watch her welcome home video, you'll see that I was really affected by it. So it was my first ever experience with a dropped tail, and that's why I'm super excited to share what I learned with you guys. And I'll again share that later after I'm done showing you how fast her tail grew back. But at first it just looked like this little pointy star-shaped tissue, and she dropped it at the very top of her tail. So she dropped it at the base. Leopard geckos can drop it anywhere, but she dropped the whole entire thing, so she had to regrow all of it. At this point, because it was clear of debris, she hadn't been on loose substrate during shipping, and because it didn't look like it needed to be cleaned, I didn't do anything to it. But I'll cover some tips later on if your gecko does have any debris in it. Just keep that in mind for later in the video. So the first thing that happened is the tail started to have a weird looking scab, and that was a few days later. So it had a dry scab, and it wasn't like a red scab, as you can see. It was kind of a clearish looking scab. That's the very first thing that happened. Here is a closer look at the scab, which thickened over the next couple of days. And typically, I wouldn't handle a gecko until their tail has started to grow back, but I wanted to get a real close look at it because I wasn't really sure if that was normal because, again, this was my first experience ever with a dropped tail. So I just wanted to get a really good look at it, make sure it wasn't infected or anything. It can be difficult to tell, but the scab was actually being pushed off by the tail that had started to grow in. So originally the scab was covering the pointy star-shaped tissue, and then as the days went by, the tissue was regenerating and was pushing the scab off of her body. So eventually in the next picture you'll see a little nub and the scab had completely fallen off. And here it is. Here is the start of her new tail. It looks so funny, but as you can see, that pointy part at the bottom, that will be eventually the end of her tail. And it just looks super funny at this point, but you can see all that new, fresh, pink skin, and it looks really funny. Here's the nub as it continues to grow, and also there's a side view, so you can just see how lovely and cute it is, but also so weird looking. As the nub grew, it started to shed on its own independently from her body. So as you see, there's a really clear, thin layer of shed on her tail, but her body isn't in shed, which was so weird because, again, this was my first regrown tail, and I was like, is that normal? So I just let it do its thing. I didn't pull the shed off or anything. It wasn't restricting the tail, so I wasn't worried about it. But over the next few days, the shed fell off on its own, and it was so it was so thin like paper, and it felt really weird. It was not like normal shed, and it obviously just looks different too visually than normal shed. But yeah, her tail decided to shed all on its own, and then it was just a few days until it all came off, and right there you can see as the tail grew, it was just the little tip that was left. And I didn't pick at it because I wanted it to just sort itself out, but it definitely made me a little anxious. And then eventually the tail was just completely normal. There was no shed on it, and it started to get speckles, and it started to get ridges, and the tail tip started to curl, which was so cute. At this point, she was actually wiggling the tail a little bit, which was really cool. Her former owner said that she had never seen Elia move her tail at all, so this was kind of a big deal for us. and there it is again. You can see the tail tip curved. That's something that she did and still does to this day. She curls the tip of it to the side, which is just so precious. If you look closely, you can also see there's some orange spotting starting to develop and all the ridges. It looks like an actual tail. And same here again, you can see more ridges, and the tail just continues to grow and fill out in shape. And it'll develop more spots, especially like orange ones, because it doesn't have many orange ones right now, but it will later on. So at this point, it had been like a month and a week, and her tail was looking like an actual tail. As you can see, it had a really great shape. And I knew that it probably would fill out still and get bigger, which it definitely did, but it looked like an actual tail instead of like a weird fleshy pink nub. There weren't drastic changes from that tail until now, with the exception of, more coloring, and it obviously like filled out more and grew a bit more, but the general shape had stayed the same. And again, you'll see that later when you see the full tail. But this period of time, she started to use the tail, like to lean on it, which was really awesome because, as you probably have seen, her back legs are bent inwards. You'll see in this photo here that she actually was standing up and using the tail to support her back end, which she used her original tail for, but I think this one might work even better because it's short and wide. Her other tail was like longer and a little bit thinner because it was a original tail and they look quite different. But yeah, it was really nice to see her be able to use the tail to support her body. The tail continued to fill out, especially with one side because she kept it like tilted. She kept the end of her tail curved, so I think one side like filled out with a bump, as you can see, and the other side stayed more smooth. So it doesn't have perfect symmetry, but it's like still a really nice regrown tail because some of them just look really crazy. But you can see there's a lot of orange spotting that started to develop, and her whole tail had developed these lovely black spots. So even though it didn't grow a lot more in terms of its shape, it definitely got a lot more coloring. Here's another perfect example of her using it for support and her curling the tip of her tail. Look how cute. Oh, she's also completely tail waved at me, which was insane. It's actually in her welcome home video, I think, when I first put her in the new enclosure. You can see her wiggle her tail at me, which was really exciting for me and her former owner because she had never done that with her old tail. Here you can see it's just big and thick and just becoming a lovely tail. But between September, October, November, and now December, there haven't really been a lot of changes in terms of its shape and size. If anything, it just gained maybe a little bit more color, but I wanted to wait long enough so that I could be certain that it wouldn't make any big changes before I posted a video, and then I was like, oh, look at me looking dumb, it's changed more and I've already posted the video, so I wanted to give it plenty of time. And if you're confused at all because the coloring looks weird, like in this photo here, it looks pink, but in the previous photo, it looks like really light purple or like a whitish purple. It's just the lighting. The tail in general is just really light in color, and yeah, see how it looks completely different in this picture? Yeah, it's just the lighting. But you can see all the lovely orange, and this is her tail right now. This is the most recent photo I have, and it is completely grown back. If you're wondering how I got Elia's tail to grow back so thick and beautiful and so fast, then stay tuned because I have a couple tips, one of which is cleanliness, and we'll talk about that first. So if you have your gecko on like loose substrate, especially if it's like sand or eco earth, because I feel like those are the two that are going to be just the most nasty and sticking to the wound. If you keep your leopard gecko on those and then it drops its tail and those particles are on the tissue, you're going to want to take some saline solution and rinse it off. Now this is going to be stressful for your gecko, but it's going to be necessary because you want your gecko to be able to not have an infection. So you clean it off with some saline solution, which will be really easy because it squirts out of a bottle and it'll just wipe off easily. And if you're still worried about cleanliness, you can get some Neosporin without pain reliever and put it on the wound. Now, I would obviously recommend not keeping your gecko on loose substrate until the tail has started to regrow, because you don't want substrate to get stuck to the, fresh tissue or like the initial wound. And I would recommend changing out whatever substrate you're using, which should be paper towel in my opinion, because it'll be like a quarantine type of setup. I recommend changing it often just to avoid infection. If there is no debris in the wound and you're not worried about infection, I wouldn't even bother using saline solution or Neosporin, because the tail will grow back fine on its own. This is something that leopard geckos are meant to do, and so I wouldn't over treat it. I wouldn't be, playing doctor with it or being too nervous about it. Again, I didn't do anything to Elia's and it grew back just fine and there was no infection. And also, do not use alcohol and do not use peroxide. Just don't use them. They're not good for the tissue. Secondly, you're going to want to make sure you feed your gecko a lot more, because leopard geckos, when they lose their tails, it takes a lot of energy to regrow it, and they can't rely on the fat stored in their tail to provide any of that energy. So it's like a double hit. So you have to make sure you're feeding them more often and more insects when you're feeding them to make sure that they have the energy needed to regrow that tail well. This is especially the case if it's a juvenile or some sort of malnourished rescue gecko, or if it loses its whole tail, because regenerating part of a tail doesn't take as much energy as regenerating a whole tail. So those are just some things to keep in mind. I definitely recommend feeding more often, because it's just really going to help your gecko utilize all the energy that you can give it to grow back the tail. So now we're going to cover some frequently asked questions in regards to dropped tails. The one that makes most sense to start with is, why do they do it? So in the wild, leopard geckos drop their tails as a defense mechanism. So if a predator is hunting them, they can drop their tail and it will wiggle on the ground and distract the predator while the leopard gecko escapes to live another day. In captivity, you can find that leopard geckos drop their tails for a lot of reasons. The most common one, in my opinion, are being attacked by another animal or being mishandled, which is often by children. They can also just get spooked, generally frightened, and drop their tails. And they can also get their tails trapped under an enclosure ornament or piece of decor, and because they can't free their tail, they'll drop it. A gecko might also drop its tail if it is sick or if it is under a lot of stress. So sometimes it can be something like having really improper husbandry or having illness that will make a gecko drop their tail. The second question I see most often asked is, how do I prevent my gecko from dropping its tail? Basically, don't grab your gecko by its tail and don't handle your gecko roughly. This is especially the case with children because they don't understand how to respectfully and calmly hold animals. So if you have a child and the leopard gecko is its pet, I recommend sitting with them while they handle it or teaching them how to handle it. Don't expose your gecko to predators. Often, the most common type of drop tail I see in my DMs is from a cat or other animal attacking a leopard gecko. So just don't do that. Don't take your leopard gecko outside on a leash. They're not a dog. Okay, they're gonna get startled and drop their tail. I've also seen geckos drop tails from improper husbandry, and obviously it's not something like a simple mistake, but severe improper husbandry. And I've also seen it happen from geckos that are just extremely stressed. Again, Elia dropped hers in shipping. So those are just some things to keep in mind. Another question that I've seen quite a bit is, can my gecko drop its tail more than once? And the answer is yes. So leopard geckos have different rungs on their tails. You can see the fleshy bumps, the grooves in their tail. And they can drop it at any point from the bottom of the tail to the base along those rungs. If your gecko drops its tail at the base and regrows a tail, it will only ever regrow a tail or drop a tail from the base. If your gecko drops its tail somewhere lower down, then it can drop its tail at that point again, or it can drop it anywhere higher up to the base. So I hope that makes sense. Does a leopard gecko's drop tail bleed? Does it hurt? Yeah, it bleeds. It's not a lot, so if you're really affected by gore, it's not that bad. And then as for pain, I'm sure it hurts, but it's something that they are built with. It's something that is evolutionary for them. It's something they're meant to do. So you don't have to panic and act like your gecko is going to die, because it most likely will not. So you just have to understand that it's something that happens. It's not something their leg fell off. Their legs aren't supposed to fall off, but their tails are. I often see people panic when this happens, and I understand it, because when I first opened the box and Elia's tail was completely separate from her body, I got very emotional. So it's definitely something I can understand you having an emotional response to. But just keep in mind, like I said, that this is something that they're meant to do. Like, it's not something that's like an injury that happens to them for no reason. The tail drop is something that has been evolutionarily programmed into them. So don't panic, it will be okay. Will a leopard gecko's regrown tail look the same as the original? Nope, it will never look the same as the original. It's fatter, it's shorter, sometimes it can have a really weird shape, the texture is going to be different, the color is going to be different. It just looks completely different. Like, as soon as you look at a gecko that has a regrown tail, you can tell it's a regrown tail. So, it's never going to look the same. Don't hope that it will when it grows back. Just, know it's not going to look similar. Can my leopard gecko regrow 2 tails? No. So I have seen some, people feature a gecko that has 2 nubs, and they'll be like, oh, my gecko grew 2 tails. No, they're not 2 tails. They're just one really weird regrown tail that has a side nub. It is not 2 tails. Unless your gecko is born with 2 tails, and they drop both of them, and they both grow back, then no, your gecko does not have 2 tails. Why are geckos with regrown tails cheaper? Basically, they're considered uglier. They're considered less desirable and less wanted. So just like any other marketable thing, if it's uglier, people don't want it as much, so it's priced cheaper. You can compare that to a normal leopard gecko morph, like a high yellow or a wild type, and then compare it to a higher end morph, I don't know, we'll just use an Enigma, for example, which I don't recommend buying, but anyways, one of them is going to be much higher in cost because it's considered more desirable physically. When you look at it, it's more stunning. And so, just because it looks different doesn't mean that its life is any more or less important. I just want to put that out there, that whether or not your gecko is a normal morph or has a regrown tail or doesn't, each leopard gecko is deserving of a great quality of life. Can a gecko with a regrown tail live a long and healthy life? Yes. A gecko with a regrown tail will live just as long and healthily as any other gecko, as long as it's well cared for, of course. There are no differences in their health just because they drop their tail. Can I handle my gecko if it dropped its tail? In the long run, yes. You can handle a gecko with a dropped tail as much as any other gecko. But just keep in mind that when there's a fresh wound, when the tail drop is initial, it's a really stressful time for them, and you're going to want to let them recover and start growing back their tail before you handle them. Now, I mentioned earlier with Elia that I handled her just because I wanted to get closer look at her scab because I wasn't sure if it was normal. I'll let you know right now, it was just fine. The scab was normal. But yeah, it's just a stressful time for them, so I wouldn't recommend it unless you had to. How long does the tail take to regrow? As you saw with Elia, it took just a matter of months to really flesh out into what it was going to look like. Even if it didn't have all of the coloration until a few months later, it was pretty much grown back in between 2 and 3 months. And that's because I fed her extra, fed her more often. If that's something that you don't do, it's going to take a lot longer to grow that tail. So I really recommend feeding more often and feeding more when you are feeding. Is it normal for a gecko to drop its tail at night with no indication as to why? No, that's not normal at all, but just because it's not normal doesn't mean that it can't happen. In fact, I've seen this happen in other species like a crested gecko, but I have never seen that happen in a leopard gecko. But again, just because I've never seen it doesn't mean that it's impossible. So if you're wondering how you can force your gecko to drop its tail, I just want to be really clear about that. I do not recommend it for most geckos and most people. I mean, there are experienced leopard gecko keepers, gecko breeders who have, experience in getting geckos to drop their tails, and a lot of times it's because there's tail rot or infection from stuck shed or a bite. I just want to reiterate, I don't recommend that most people do this. Just because you may have seen someone else talk about doing it, or maybe you've even seen someone do it firsthand, it's a stressful thing to like make your gecko experience, and you could very easily just take your gecko to the vet and have the area of the tail that needs to be removed surgically removed. So again, I really don't recommend it. I'm not going to suggest how to do it. I've never done it myself. And if it's something that needs to happen because your gecko's tail is either, dead or dying, take it to the vet. Also, if your gecko has any part of its tail surgically removed, yes, it will grow back. So it's not like your gecko has to drop it for it to grow back. The moment that it is cut off, it will realize, oh no, I must regenerate, and it will start to grow back. Lastly, and quite possibly the most important question, why is it important for a leopard gecko to regenerate its tail? Because that's its fat storage. So when they are brumating or ovulating, which are periods in which they will often go off food, it's really important for them to have that fat storage as a backup to keep them able to sustain themselves throughout those time periods. I've also included this recent clip of Elia eating, which was in the Feeding All My Reptiles video. If you're interested in watching that, I'll include it linked above. But that's all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions that you think I did not address fully or didn't address at all, please let me know down below and I will get back to you. And also please subscribe, hit the notification bell, leave a like, all that good stuff. And I will see you guys in the next one. Bye!